Sometimes the person who changes your life is the one everyone else overlooks. The dinner rush at Harbor Street Grill had already turned into a disaster by 6:30 that evening. Plates moved in every direction. Orders were delayed. Customers filled nearly every table. Yet none of that was what had restaurant employees whispering nervously near the kitchen. Their attention remained fixed on table 27. The man sitting there had arrived less than 30 minutes earlier, and already 3 waitresses had asked to be reassigned. The first returned to the kitchen looking close to tears. The second lasted less than 10 minutes before requesting another section. The third simply shook her head and walked away. Nobody seemed able to make the customer happy. "I am serious," one waitress whispered. "Nothing is good enough for him." "What did he even complain about?" another asked. "Everything." At a corner table near the windows, Alexander Hayes sat alone in a dark gray jacket, quietly studying the city street outside. He did not raise his voice. He did not insult anyone. Yet somehow every interaction ended badly. One server forgot his drink order. Another brought the wrong entree. A third spent more time apologizing than listening. By now even the manager, Rachel Morgan, looked exhausted. She glanced around the restaurant and spotted the only available employee left. Emily Brooks. 27 years old. Blonde ponytail. Simple uniform. End of a 12-hour shift. Rachel hurried over. "Emily, I need you to take table 27. Emily followed her gaze. "The table everyone is running away from?" Rachel sighed. "Please." Emily looked toward the man by the window. He seemed calm enough. "Tired, maybe. Certainly not terrifying." "Fine," she said. "But if he throws a plate at me, I am quitting." Rachel laughed nervously. "He has not done that." "Good. My standards are low tonight." Carrying a notepad, Emily approached the table. Alexander barely looked up when she arrived. "Good evening," she said. "I am Emily." Alexander nodded once. "Alexander." Emily waited. "That is all?" For the first time, he looked directly at her. "What else would there be?" Emily tucked her pen behind one ear. "Usually people tell me what they want to order." Alexander studied her expression. She did not seem intimidated. That was new. "I already ordered." "Right." And apparently hated everything about the experience. A nearby customer almost dropped a fork. Nobody spoke to table 27 that way. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "That is what they are saying?" Emily glanced toward the kitchen where several employees were pretending not to watch. "Pretty much." Alexander looked back at his untouched meal. "Maybe they are right." Emily folded her arms. "Or maybe food is not the problem." Silence settled between them. For one long second, the entire restaurant seemed to stop moving. Then something unexpected happened. Alexander Hayes laughed. Not politely. Not briefly. Actually laughed. The sound surprised even him. And standing there beside the table, Emily had no idea that she had just become the first person in years to make one of America's most powerful billionaires smile. Most people spend years trying to impress powerful men. Emily Brooks accidentally annoyed one in less than 5 minutes. After Alexander's unexpected laughter faded, the tension that had gripped Harbor Street Grill seemed to loosen slightly. Employees returned to work, although many continued stealing curious glances toward table 27. Emily remained standing beside the table, holding her notepad. "Well," she said, "now that we know you can smile, maybe we can solve the mystery." Alexander tilted his head. "What mystery?" "Why every waitress in this restaurant thinks serving you is the fastest route to emotional exhaustion." Another smile threatened to appear on his face. "Perhaps they are exaggerating." Emily looked at the untouched entree in front of him. "The evidence says otherwise." For the first time all evening, Alexander looked down at the plate. The steak was cooked correctly. The vegetables were fine. The meal itself was not the problem. Emily noticed his hesitation immediately. "You do not actually hate the food, do you?" she asked. Alexander was silent for a moment. "No." "Then why send it back?" He glanced toward the window. Outside, headlights moved through the busy city streets. "Because nobody listens." Emily frowned. "That is a strange complaint from a customer." "Is it?" he asked. "Every server comes over already expecting me to complain. They apologize before I even speak. They hear what they think I will say instead of what I actually say." Emily considered that. Annoyingly, he had a point. "So what were you trying to tell them?" Alexander pointed at the plate. "I ordered grilled asparagus. This is broccoli." Emily stared at him. "You caused 3 staffing emergencies over broccoli?" "It is the principle." Emily laughed so hard she nearly dropped her pen. Several nearby customers turned to look. Alexander found himself laughing again. The sound felt unfamiliar. Comfortable. Strange. When Emily finally regained control, she shook her head. "You know, normal people would just eat the broccoli. I am beginning to suspect you do not think very highly of me. I do not know you well enough yet." The answer surprised him. Most people either feared him or tried to impress him. Emily did neither. 20 minutes later she returned with the correct order. Alexander thanked her. Actually thanked her. The kitchen staff nearly fainted. As the evening continued, Emily checked on him only when necessary. No excessive attention. No nervous apologies. No forced friendliness. She treated him exactly like every other customer. Oddly enough, Alexander realized he liked that. Near closing time, Emily arrived with the check. "Long day?" Alexander asked unexpectedly. Emily glanced at the clock. 12-hour shift. That sounds exhausting. She shrugged. Rent does not pay itself. Then Rachel called her name from across the restaurant. Emily offered a quick smile and hurried away. Alexander watched her disappear into the kitchen. A few minutes later he paid the bill and stood to leave. But before walking out, he did something he had not planned to do. He looked toward Rachel and asked a simple question. "Will Emily be working tomorrow?" Rachel blinked in surprise. "Yes." Alexander nodded once. Then he left. Across the room, Emily never heard the conversation. She had no idea that the difficult customer everyone feared had just made a decision. Tomorrow, he was coming back. The next evening, Harbor Street Grill was just as busy as usual. Emily arrived 15 minutes early, tied her apron, grabbed her order pad, and prepared herself for another long shift. Rent was due in 9 days. Her mother's medical bills were waiting on the kitchen counter at home. And her second job at a grocery store started at 7 the next morning. The last thing on her mind was table 27. Unfortunately, table 27 seemed to have her on its mind. At exactly 6 o'clock, Rachel appeared beside her carrying a familiar expression. "Do not tell me," Emily said immediately. Rachel pointed toward the dining room. "He is back." Emily looked across the restaurant and immediately spotted Alexander sitting at the same corner table by the window. He was reading something on his phone while sipping water. Unlike the previous evening, he seemed completely relaxed. "Maybe he liked the broccoli after all," Emily muttered. Rachel lowered her voice. "He specifically requested you." Emily blinked. "Seriously?" Rachel nodded. Word for word. He asked if Emily was working tonight. That information somehow made Emily more nervous than hearing he was difficult. She sighed and grabbed her notepad. "Fine. But if he starts a national debate about vegetables again, I am leaving." When she approached the table, Alexander looked up and offered something that looked suspiciously like a genuine smile. "Good evening, Emily." Good evening, Alexander. She glanced around dramatically. No complaints yet? The night is still young. Emily rolled her eyes. I walked directly into that one. To her surprise, Alexander laughed again. It was becoming a habit. As she took his order, the conversation felt oddly natural. There was no tension. No awkwardness. Just two people talking. So what do you do? Alexander asked. Emily nearly dropped her pen. Besides carrying plates? Yes. I carry groceries every Saturday morning at my second job. He frowned. Second job? Welcome to adulthood. Alexander studied her face. She did not sound bitter. Just practical. That sounds exhausting. Emily shrugged. Most people are tired. Some just have nicer furniture. For a moment Alexander simply stared at her. Nobody spoke to him this way. People usually measured every word around him. Emily seemed completely uninterested in impressing anyone. Across the room, several employees noticed something unusual. The customer everyone feared was actually smiling. More than smiling. He seemed engaged. Interested. Human. I think she broke him, one waiter whispered. I think she fixed him, another replied. Meanwhile, Emily delivered his meal and continued her shift. Nearly an hour later she returned to check on him. Alexander had finished almost everything on his plate. Let me guess, Emily said. The asparagus was acceptable? Excellent. She placed a hand dramatically over her heart. I will treasure this compliment forever. Alexander shook his head, still smiling. Then his expression softened slightly. You make this place feel different. Emily frowned. Different how? He glanced around the crowded restaurant. Most people spend their time trying to be somewhere else. Emily followed his gaze. Families eating dinner. Couples talking. Employees rushing between tables. And me? She asked. Alexander looked directly at her. You seem happy exactly where you are. Emily laughed softly. If only he knew. But before she could answer, Rachel called her name from the kitchen. Emily hurried away, unaware that Alexander continued watching her long after she disappeared through the swinging doors. And for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow more than the next business deal. By the end of the week, a strange routine had formed. Every evening around 6 o'clock, Alexander appeared at Harbor Street Grill. Every evening, he requested the same table by the window. And every evening, Emily ended up serving him whether she planned to or not. The rest of the staff had stopped questioning it. In fact, many of them were grateful. As one waiter put it, Emily seemed to be the only person capable of keeping table 27 from becoming a restaurant-wide crisis. On Friday evening, Emily approached his table carrying a glass of iced tea before he even asked for it. Look at that, Alexander said. You remembered. Emily set the glass down. Do not get emotional. It is literally my job. I was about to thank you. That would be a dangerous precedent. Alexander shook his head, smiling. More and more often, he found himself forgetting why he originally came. At first he had been curious. Then amused. Now he simply enjoyed being there. For 1 hour each evening, nobody expected anything from him. Nobody wanted signatures. Nobody wanted investments. Nobody wanted favors. Emily did not know who he was, and somehow that felt like freedom. As the dinner rush continued, Emily moved quickly between tables. She delivered meals, refilled drinks, and somehow managed to remember every customer's request without writing half of them down. Alexander watched her work with genuine fascination. Most people complained when life became difficult. Emily seemed to become stronger. Later that evening, a family entered the restaurant just before closing. A tired mother. 2 young children. and a father carrying an infant wrapped in a blanket. The restaurant was nearly full. Rachel quietly informed them there would be a long wait. The family thanked her and prepared to leave. Before they reached the door, Emily stepped forward. "Give me a second." She quickly rearranged several tables near the back of the restaurant and created enough space for the family to sit together. The children smiled immediately. The exhausted parents looked relieved. Rachel frowned. "You did not have to do that." Emily shrugged. They looked like they needed a good night. Then she returned to work as though nothing unusual had happened. Across the room, Alexander had witnessed everything. The family never knew Emily had gone out of her way to help them. She did not do it for praise. She did not do it for tips. She simply noticed someone having a hard day and decided to make it a little easier. That stayed with Alexander long after the moment passed. Near closing time, Emily finally returned to his table. She looked exhausted. A few loose strands of hair had escaped her ponytail. Yet somehow she was still smiling. "Long day?" Alexander asked. "I worked 16 hours yesterday." "And today?" "Only 12 so far." Alexander stared at her. "That is not healthy." Emily laughed softly. "Neither is paying rent late." The answer lingered in his mind. For the first time, he began wondering about the life waiting for her outside the restaurant. What happened after she left each night? Why was she working so hard? And why did someone who carried so many burdens still find reasons to help strangers? As Emily walked away to finish her shift, Alexander realized something that caught him completely off guard. He was no longer returning because he enjoyed the conversation. He was returning because he wanted to know the woman behind the smile. The next Monday began at 5:30 in the morning for Emily Brooks. While most of the city was still asleep, she was already stocking shelves at a neighborhood grocery store on the east side of Manhattan. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as she organized boxes of cereal and canned goods. Her feet still hurt from the previous night's restaurant shift, but she kept moving. There was always something that needed to be done. At 8 o'clock she finished her shift, bought a discounted cup of coffee, and headed across town to visit her mother. The small apartment smelled faintly of soup and fresh laundry. Emily's mother sat near the window reading a paperback novel. The woman smiled immediately when Emily walked in. "You look tired." Emily kissed her forehead. "You say that every day." "Because it is true every day." Emily laughed and placed a grocery bag on the kitchen table. Most of the food inside had come from employee discounts. Every dollar mattered. While her mother prepared tea, Emily quietly sorted through a stack of medical bills that had arrived over the weekend. She never complained about them. She simply added them to the growing list of responsibilities she carried. By early afternoon she was back at Harbor Street Grill preparing for another shift. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander sat in a conference room overlooking Midtown Manhattan. 12 executives occupied the table around him. Charts filled the presentation screens. Numbers worth hundreds of millions of dollars were being discussed. Yet Alexander found himself staring out the window instead. "Alexander," one executive finally asked. "Do you have any thoughts on the proposal?" Alexander blinked. "What?" Several people exchanged surprised glances. It was not like him to lose focus. For years he had been the sharpest person in every room. Now his attention seemed somewhere else entirely. Later that evening, Alexander arrived at Harbor Street Grill earlier than usual. Emily noticed him immediately. "You know there are other restaurants in New York, right?" she asked while refilling his water glass. "I checked. They all seem disappointing." Emily laughed. "You are impossible." "That is what everyone tells me." As the evening continued, Alexander found himself paying closer attention than ever. He noticed how Emily greeted every customer by name when she could remember it. He noticed how she carried extra crackers to a child who looked hungry while waiting for dinner. He noticed how she never sat down, never complained, and somehow still managed to smile. Then something happened that stayed with him. A new employee accidentally dropped a tray near the kitchen entrance. Several drinks spilled across the floor. The young server looked horrified. Rachel immediately began scolding him. Before the situation could get worse, Emily stepped forward. "It is okay," she said. "Everybody drops a tray eventually." The nervous employee looked grateful. Then Emily quietly handed him half of her own tips from the evening. "For the drinks that got wasted," she whispered. The young man stared at her. "I cannot take this." "Sure you can." "Why?" Emily smiled. "Because somebody helped me when I was new." Then she walked away before he could argue. Across the room, Alexander had seen everything. The gesture was small. Most people would never notice it. But he did. And in that moment, something changed. It was no longer admiration. It was no longer curiosity. For the first time, Alexander Hayes realized he was beginning to care about Emily Brooks far more than he should. Over the next 2 weeks, Alexander continued returning to Harbor Street Grill almost every evening. To everyone else, he was simply a regular customer. To Emily, he was the strange man who took dinner very seriously and somehow always ended up asking questions she never expected. One rainy Thursday night, the restaurant was quieter than usual. Water streaked across the front windows while soft music played through the speakers overhead. Emily arrived at table 27 carrying a basket of bread. "Good news," she announced. "Nobody confused asparagus with broccoli today." Alexander smiled. "Progress. I knew you would be proud." As she turned to leave, Alexander noticed something. The sleeve of her uniform jacket was slightly torn near the wrist. It was a small detail, but once he saw it, he began noticing others. Her shoes were worn. Her phone screen had a crack running across one corner. Even her order pad was held together with tape. Emily never complained about any of it. She simply kept working. Later that evening, Alexander stepped outside to take a phone call. The moment he answered, his entire demeanor changed. "Move the meeting to Monday," he said. "I do not care what the board wants." The voice on the other end protested. Alexander's expression hardened. "Then tell them I said no." He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. When he returned inside, Emily immediately noticed the difference. "You look annoyed." Alexander sat down. "Do I?" "A little." She placed a glass of water in front of him. "Whatever happened out there, it will probably still exist tomorrow." Alexander laughed softly. "That is surprisingly wise." "I learned it from carrying plates." He shook his head. "You have an answer for everything." Emily leaned against the table briefly. "No. I just learned that worrying does not pay bills." The comment lingered in Alexander's mind long after she walked away. A few hours later, closing time finally arrived. Employees cleaned tables while customers filtered toward the exits. Emily was gathering receipts when she noticed something unusual on table 27. A large white envelope rested beside the check folder. She picked it up immediately and hurried toward the door. Alexander had already reached the sidewalk. "Hey," she called. He turned around. Rain drizzled lightly from the dark sky. Emily held up the envelope. "You forgot something." For a split second, Alexander said nothing. Because he had not forgotten it. Inside was several $1,000s in cash. He had left it intentionally. Not as a test. Not as charity. He simply wanted to help. But standing there beneath the city lights, looking at Emily's determined expression, he suddenly realized what would happen next. She reached him and pressed the envelope into his hand. "You almost lost this." Alexander looked at her. "What if I meant to leave it?" Emily folded her arms. "Then you left it with the wrong person. You could have kept it." She stared at him as though he had spoken another language. No, I could not. Why? Emily shrugged. Because it is not mine. The answer was simple. Immediate. Honest. And in that moment, standing in the rain outside a small Manhattan restaurant, Alexander felt something shift inside him. For years he had surrounded himself with people who wanted something from him. Money. Access. Opportunity. Influence. Yet the woman standing in front of him wanted none of it. And that realization affected him far more than he was prepared to admit. After the night in the rain, something quietly changed between Alexander and Emily. Neither of them mentioned the envelope again, yet the moment lingered in both their minds. For Alexander, it became impossible to ignore what he had already begun to realize. Emily's kindness was not an act. It was not something she turned on when people were watching. It was simply who she was. The following Saturday evening, Harbor Street Grill was unusually crowded. A local concert had just ended nearby, and customers filled every available table. Emily moved through the dining room with her usual energy, balancing trays, answering questions, and somehow keeping everyone happy. Alexander sat at his regular table watching the organized chaos unfold. He had spent the morning reviewing acquisition reports worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet somehow this felt more interesting. Halfway through the evening, the front door opened and an elderly man stepped inside. His coat was worn. His shoes had clearly seen better days. He hesitated near the entrance as though unsure whether he belonged there. Several customers barely noticed him. Others looked away. The man quietly approached Rachel and asked whether there was any inexpensive meal available. Rachel glanced at the nearly full dining room and sighed impatiently. "We are very busy tonight." The man nodded apologetically and began moving toward the door. Before he could leave, Emily intercepted him. "Wait a second." She guided him toward a small table near the back. "Give me 5 minutes." The man looked embarrassed. "I do not want to cause trouble." "You are not causing trouble." Emily disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later she returned carrying a hot meal and a cup of coffee. The man's eyes widened. "I cannot afford this." Emily smiled. "Good thing somebody already paid for it." The man looked around the restaurant. "Who?" Emily simply shrugged and pointed toward the food. "Eat while it is hot." Then she returned to work before he could ask another question. Across the room, Alexander watched the entire exchange. Several minutes later he quietly called Emily over. "Did you pay for that meal?" Emily glanced toward the elderly man. "Maybe." "Why?" She looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because he was hungry." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "You do realize most people would not do that." Emily folded her arms. "Most people are not responsible for my decisions." The answer made him smile. "You always have an answer." "That is because you keep asking questions." Before Alexander could respond, a young busboy approached Emily. The teenager looked nervous. "Miss Brooks?" "Yeah?" "My car will not start after work. I do not know how I am getting home." Emily immediately pulled out her phone. "I will give you a ride." "That is 40 minutes out of your way." "Then we should leave on time." The young employee looked relieved. Once again, she helped someone without hesitation. Without recognition. Without expecting anything in return. As the night continued, Alexander found himself unable to focus on his meal. The more he learned about Emily, the more remarkable she became. Most people spent their lives searching for successful people. Yet somehow the most impressive person he had met in years was a waitress working double shifts and driving coworkers home after midnight. And for the first time, Alexander stopped wondering whether he liked Emily. The truth had become impossible to avoid. He was already falling in love with her. The following week brought the first cold winds of autumn to Manhattan. Leaves drifted along sidewalks, and customers arrived at Harbor Street Grill wearing heavier coats and carrying steaming cups of coffee. For Emily, the season changed nothing. She still worked long hours. She still split her time between jobs. And she still somehow found ways to help everyone around her. For Alexander, however, everything was changing. He now found himself planning his schedule around dinner. Meetings ended earlier. Calls were postponed. Entire evenings were quietly rearranged so he could spend an hour inside a small neighborhood restaurant. One Tuesday evening, Alexander arrived carrying a worn leather wallet. The idea had come to him after several sleepless nights. Not because he doubted Emily's character. If anything, he already trusted her more than he trusted most people in his life. Yet a small part of him wanted confirmation of what his heart already knew. The restaurant was busy when he arrived. Emily greeted him with her usual smile. "Let me guess. You came back for the asparagus." Alexander looked serious. "I have developed a deep emotional attachment to the asparagus." Emily laughed and shook her head. Throughout dinner they talked more than usual. About books. About favorite places in New York. About the strange customers Emily had encountered over the years. Alexander noticed how easy conversation felt with her. There was no strategy. No negotiation. No hidden agenda. Just honesty. Near the end of the meal, he quietly left the wallet beneath the table and walked toward the exit. Halfway down the block, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. Curious, he answered. "Hello?" "Congratulations," Emily's voice said immediately. "You are officially the most forgetful customer in Manhattan." Alexander stopped walking. "Emily? I found your driver's license inside the wallet." "That is how phones work." A smile spread across his face. "I see. You left your wallet under the table." "Did I?" "Nice try." Alexander laughed. "What do you mean?" "I mean nobody accidentally leaves a wallet containing enough cash to buy a used car." Alexander glanced up at the city lights. "Maybe I was distracted. Maybe you watched too many movies." 20 minutes later they met outside the restaurant. Emily handed him the wallet. Alexander opened it. Everything remained exactly where it had been. Not $1 missing. Not one credit card touched. "Thank you," he said. Emily looked genuinely confused. "For returning your own wallet?" "Most people would not have chased me 6 blocks." Emily shrugged. "Most people are strange." Before Alexander could respond, a luxury black SUV pulled to the curb nearby. Emily glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to him. She had no idea that vehicles like that were a routine part of Alexander's life. The driver remained inside, waiting. Alexander noticed her looking at the SUV. For one dangerous second, he wondered if the truth was about to come out. But Emily simply smiled. "Try not to lose anything else tonight." Then she turned and walked back toward the restaurant. Alexander watched her disappear through the front doors. He should have felt relieved. Instead he felt guilty. Because every day that passed made the secret harder to keep. And somewhere in the distance, a storm he could not yet see was already moving toward both of them. The storm arrived on a Wednesday evening just after 7 o'clock. Not the kind that came with rain or thunder. The kind that entered through the front door wearing an expensive suit and carrying enough influence to change lives. Emily was delivering drinks to a family near the center of the restaurant when Rachel suddenly straightened behind the host stand. Several employees turned toward the entrance. A tall man in his early 40s stepped inside surrounded by an air of confidence that seemed to command attention. His name was Derek Collins, though most people in the financial world knew him for very different reasons. He was one of the most aggressive investors in the country and a longtime business rival of Alexander Hayes. Emily knew none of that. To her, he was simply another customer. "Table for one?" she asked politely. Derek barely glanced at her. His attention had already landed elsewhere. Specifically, on the familiar figure sitting at table 27. For a split second, genuine surprise crossed Derek's face. Then he smiled. Well, this is unexpected. Alexander looked up from his meal and immediately recognized him. His expression darkened. Derek walked directly toward the table. Several customers watched curiously. Alexander Hayes, Derek announced loudly. The last place I expected to find a billionaire CEO is in a neighborhood restaurant. The room seemed to freeze. Emily stopped moving. Rachel nearly dropped a menu. A waiter carrying drinks almost walked into a chair. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. The secret was gone. Derek pulled out a chair without being invited. You disappeared from a shareholder dinner for this place? He asked. That must be one incredible steak. No one laughed. Because nobody was paying attention to Derek anymore. Every employee in the restaurant was staring at Alexander. Billionaire CEO. The words echoed through the room. Emily looked from Derek to Alexander and back again. Suddenly dozens of strange details began connecting inside her mind. The luxury SUV. The phone calls. The expensive watch he always wore. The effortless confidence. The way people occasionally glanced at him as though they recognized him. Alexander slowly stood. Derek, this is neither the time nor the place. Derek smiled. Really? Because I think your waitress deserves to know who has been sitting here every night. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Alexander looked toward her. Their eyes met across the restaurant. For the first time since they met, she saw something she had never seen before. Not confidence. Not humor. Concern. Derek continued speaking. You mean she does not know? That is incredible. Rachel stared at Alexander in disbelief. You own Hayes Global? Alexander did not answer immediately. The silence was answer enough. Gasps spread through the dining room. Several customers reached for their phones. One employee whispered something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. Emily remained motionless. She felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. The man she thought she knew suddenly felt like a stranger. Alexander took a step toward her. Emily. But she raised a hand. Not angry. Not emotional. Just stunned. You are a billionaire? The question sounded ridiculous the moment it left her mouth. Yet she needed to hear him say it. Alexander nodded once. Emily looked away. Every conversation. Every joke. Every shared moment suddenly felt different. Not because of the money itself, but because of the secret. And as silence settled over Harbor Street Grill, Alexander realized something far more dangerous than Derek Collins had just exposed his identity. He might have destroyed the trust of the one person whose opinion mattered most. The atmosphere inside Harbor Street Grill never fully recovered after that night. By the time the last customer left and the chairs were being stacked onto tables, the restaurant felt unusually quiet. Employees continued whispering among themselves. Some were impressed. Others were shocked. A few seemed almost excited by the discovery. But Emily was not thinking about any of them. She was standing alone near the back entrance, staring out at the city lights while trying to process everything she had learned. Billionaire. CEO. One of the most powerful businessmen in the country. The words repeated endlessly in her mind. Footsteps approached behind her. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. Emily. Alexander's voice was calm. Careful. She took a slow breath before facing him. For the first time since they met, neither of them seemed sure what to say. Finally, Emily broke the silence. How long? Alexander understood the question immediately. From the beginning. She nodded slowly. So every conversation we had was missing something important. I never lied to you. The words escaped before he could stop them. Emily looked at him. Not angry. Just disappointed. You also never told me the truth. Alexander had no response. Because she was right. The silence between them stretched for several seconds. Then Emily laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Do you know what the worst part is? Alexander shook his head. I never cared about money. Her voice remained steady. You could have told me on the first day and it would not have changed anything. That statement hurt more than any accusation could have. Because he believed her completely. Emily looked away toward the street. I trusted you. Alexander stepped closer. Emily, please. She shook her head. I need time. Those 4 words landed harder than any business failure he had ever experienced. For years Alexander had solved problems with decisions, negotiations, and strategy. But standing there beneath the glow of a back-alley security light, he realized there was no solution he could purchase. No contract he could sign. No shortcut available. Trust could not be bought. It had to be earned. The following evening, Alexander did not come to the restaurant. Nor did he appear the day after that. For the first time in weeks, table 27 remained empty. Emily told herself she was relieved. Yet every time the front door opened, part of her still looked up. By Friday night, Rachel finally approached her during a slow moment. You miss him. Emily nearly dropped a tray. What? Rachel smiled knowingly. You keep staring at the door. I do not. You absolutely do. Emily rolled her eyes and walked away before the conversation could continue. But later that night, as she counted receipts near closing time, she noticed something unusual. A large delivery box had arrived at the restaurant. The return address listed no sender. Curious, Rachel opened it. Inside were brand new winter coats. Enough for every employee. High quality. Expensive. Practical. Attached to the top was a simple note. For people who work harder than anyone realizes. No signature. No company logo. Nothing else. Yet Emily recognized the handwriting instantly. She stared at the note without speaking. Across the city, Alexander sat alone in his penthouse office overlooking Manhattan. For the first time in years, business reports remained untouched on his desk. Because his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. And for the first time since losing Emily's trust, he began asking himself a question far more important than whether she would forgive him. Was he willing to become the kind of man who deserved it? Monday evening began like any other shift, but by 8 o'clock everything had changed. Emily was carrying a tray of drinks toward a booth near the center of the restaurant when Rachel's voice suddenly cut through the dining room. Emily. My office. Now. Conversation slowed. Several employees exchanged nervous looks. Rachel rarely raised her voice. Emily carefully set down the tray and followed her manager toward the small office near the kitchen. The moment the door closed, Rachel folded her arms. A customer is missing an envelope containing cash. Emily frowned. Okay. It disappeared from table 14. Emily waited. And? Rachel's expression hardened. And several people saw you clear that table. For a second Emily thought it was a joke. Then she realized Rachel was serious. You think I took it? Rachel slid a report across the desk. The customer claims there was over $3,000 inside. Emily stared at her. I have never taken anything from a customer. Then where is it? Emily shook her head. I do not know. Unfortunately, the accusation spread through the restaurant within minutes. Employees whispered. Customers noticed the tension. By the time Emily stepped back into the dining room, she felt dozens of eyes following her. Rachel's voice remained cold. Until this is resolved, I am taking you off the floor. Emily could barely believe what she was hearing. You are serious? I have to protect the business. The words hurt more than she expected. After everything she had done for the restaurant, Rachel was willing to believe the worst without evidence. 20 minutes later, the situation became even worse. The customer insisted on filing a formal complaint. Rachel responded immediately. Emily Brooks is no longer employed here. Silence swept across the room. Several employees looked shocked. One of the younger servers actually protested. Rachel, that cannot be right. Rachel ignored him. Emily stood frozen. She had spent years working double shifts, covering for coworkers, helping customers, and doing everything possible to support the restaurant. Now she was being escorted toward the exit over something she had not done. As she reached the front door, it opened unexpectedly. Alexander Hayes walked inside. He had not visited for over a week. The moment he saw Emily's face, he knew something was wrong. What happened? He asked. Rachel stepped forward. This does not concern you. Alexander looked directly at Emily. What happened? Emily tried to smile but failed. Apparently I stole from a customer. The statement sounded absurd even to her. Alexander's expression changed instantly. Calm. Focused. Dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with certainty. No, he said quietly. She did not. Rachel crossed her arms. And how exactly would you know? Alexander turned toward her. Because I know Emily. Rachel laughed dismissively. That is not evidence. You are right. Alexander reached into his pocket and removed his phone. Evidence is evidence. He made a single call. Less than 15 minutes later, 2 security specialists from Hayes Global entered the restaurant carrying digital equipment. Confused employees gathered around. Customers remained seated, eager to see what happened next. Rachel suddenly looked much less confident. Because for the first time since the accusation began, someone was about to examine what really happened. And as the security footage loaded onto the screens, Emily realized the truth was finally about to come out. The entire restaurant gathered around the screens. Customers remained seated. Employees stopped working. Even the kitchen staff emerged from behind the swinging doors. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. One of the security specialists connected the surveillance system and began reviewing footage from earlier that evening. Rachel stood near the office doorway with her arms crossed, though the confidence she displayed only minutes earlier had started to fade. Emily remained beside the front entrance, feeling emotionally exhausted. Alexander stood nearby but gave her space. He understood that this moment was not about him. It was about the truth. The footage began playing. Everyone watched as table 14 appeared on screen. The customer could be seen entering the restaurant carrying a white envelope. Minutes later, he placed it beside his chair while speaking on the phone. The security specialist fast-forwarded. Emily appeared in the frame, clearing dishes exactly as Rachel had described. Several people glanced toward her. Then the footage continued. Emily walked away. The envelope remained where it was. A long silence settled over the room. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. The specialist continued advancing the video. Suddenly another figure entered the frame. A busboy named Kevin. The same young employee Emily had helped weeks earlier. The room fell silent. Kevin looked around nervously before noticing the envelope beneath the table. He picked it up. For a moment it appeared as though he intended to return it. Then something changed. He slipped the envelope into his apron pocket and hurried toward the kitchen. Gasps spread through the restaurant. Rachel's face turned pale. Emily simply stared at the screen. Not because she was angry. Because she could not believe how quickly everyone had assumed the worst about her. The footage ended. No further explanation was necessary. Kevin stepped forward trembling. I am sorry, he said quietly. I needed money. Nobody spoke. Finally the customer sighed and nodded. At least now we know what happened. The security specialists saved the footage and disconnected the equipment. Around the restaurant, employees looked embarrassed. Several approached Emily immediately. One waitress apologized. Then another. Then another. Rachel remained silent the longest. Eventually she walked toward Emily. For the first time since the accusation began, her voice softened. I was wrong. Emily looked at her. Yes. Rachel lowered her eyes. I should have trusted you. Emily did not answer right away. The apology mattered. But it could not erase what had happened. Meanwhile, Alexander stepped forward and addressed the room. His calm voice immediately captured everyone's attention. For weeks, I watched Emily help strangers, support coworkers, and do the right thing when nobody was looking. He glanced toward the employees gathered around him. If any person in this restaurant deserved the benefit of the doubt, it was her. Nobody disagreed. Because everyone knew he was right. Rachel swallowed hard. Emily, I would like to offer you your job back. A faint smile appeared on Emily's face. Then she surprised everyone. No. Rachel blinked. No? Emily shook her head gently. I loved working here. But I need to work somewhere people trust me before I have to prove myself. The statement landed heavily throughout the room. Not cruel. Just honest. Alexander looked at her with unmistakable admiration. Once again, Emily had chosen dignity over convenience. As the crowd slowly dispersed, she turned toward the exit. But this time Alexander followed. Not as a billionaire. Not as a CEO. Simply as a man who had finally learned what kind of person she truly was. And for the first time since their friendship had been broken, Emily did not ask him to stay away. 3 months later, the first snow of winter drifted gently across Manhattan. The city moved at its usual pace, but life looked very different for Emily Brooks. After leaving Harbor Street Grill, she had accepted an opportunity that seemed impossible only a few months earlier. Not because someone handed her success. Because someone finally recognized the value she had always carried. The new restaurant stood on a busy corner near Central Park. Unlike most places in the city, its mission was simple. Every week, families facing difficult times could receive meals at little or no cost. Local employees were paid fairly. Young workers received training and mentorship. Community mattered as much as profit. The project had become a model for several neighborhoods throughout New York. And standing at the center of it all was Emily. On a snowy Friday evening, she walked through the dining room greeting customers by name. The restaurant was full of laughter, conversation, and warmth. Near the entrance, a framed plaque carried a simple message. Kindness is never wasted. Most guests never knew who wrote it. Emily did. A few minutes later, the front doors opened. Alexander stepped inside. Even now, seeing him still made her smile before she could stop herself. Over the past 3 months, he had done something no amount of money could accomplish instantly. He had earned back her trust one day at a time. No grand speeches. No expensive gifts. No attempts to buy forgiveness. Just honesty. Consistency. Effort. The qualities she had wanted from the beginning. You are late, Emily said as he approached. Alexander glanced at his watch. 30 seconds. That still counts. You are becoming very strict. Someone has to keep billionaires humble. He laughed softly. The sound felt familiar now. Comfortable. The same laugh that had first surprised her months ago beside table 27. Together they walked through the restaurant. Employees greeted them warmly. Families waved. Several children ran past carrying holiday decorations. Watching Emily interact with everyone around her, Alexander felt the same admiration he had felt from the very beginning. Except now it came without secrets. Without barriers. Without fear. Later that evening, after the final customers had left, they stood outside beneath the falling snow. The city lights reflected across the sidewalk. For a moment neither spoke. They simply watched the snow drift through the air. Finally, Alexander reached into his coat pocket. Emily raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried? Probably. That is not reassuring. He smiled and handed her a small envelope. Emily immediately laughed. You know this has a history. Open it. Curious, she unfolded the paper inside. Her eyes widened. It was not a check. Not a contract. Not a business proposal. It was a partnership document listing her as co-founder of the growing restaurant initiative they had built together. At the bottom was a handwritten note. None of this would exist without you. Emily looked up slowly. Alexander. His voice softened. You changed my life the day you refused to let me keep the wrong vegetables. She laughed through unexpected tears. That is not exactly romantic. It is our story. Snow settled lightly on their coats as they stood beneath the city lights. For the first time, neither future nor status seemed important. What mattered was the journey that had brought them there. A waitress who never stopped choosing kindness. A billionaire who finally learned what mattered most. And a love built not on wealth, but on trust, respect, and the simple decision to see the best in another person.